All right, so let me start that over. I want to start by saying thank you to Bianca for that welcoming intro, to Claudia Loaiza and Dr. Stacy Harwood for your hospitality, for the continuing dialogue and all the behind the scenes efforts to put this together. I want to also thank everybody here from around the country. I see a lot of familiar faces and names in the chat box. Um, Within LA, within Utah, and beyond, I'm very appreciative of all y'all coming to share space with us. And thanks to the University of Utah Department of City and Metropolitan Planning for hosting us. Um, Let me get this started. All right, let's get this up on the screen. I want to make sure everybody, let's get a thumbs up if you can hear me and if you can see my slides moving. Is that okay? All right, thank you. I've learned a lot in the Zoom world. So do always start with a technology check. So I'd like to begin my talk on embedded planning praxis also with a land acknowledgement. I'm delivering this talk from the unceded lands of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples in what is now called Pasadena, California, within what is now called Los Angeles County. I reside and work in Gabrielino and Tongva lands. The praxis discussed in our talk today was developed on and continues to evolve within these ancestral lands. As planners, we must acknowledge and respect the traditional land caretakers of this region and yours, and we must work to end the erasure of indigenous communities. This is our agenda for today. We're going to trace the origins of embedded planning back to some very formative youthful experiences. I'm going to explain the method that I used to take, this nebulous idea that I had swirling in my head for a couple years and turn that into a manifesto for praxis. Then I'll define embedded planning. I'll show you what it looks like on the ground and how it does advance equity. We'll examine both benefits and challenges, and I'll offer some takeaways for theory and practice. And we're going to conclude with a conversation where I hope to learn from all of you, from your ideas, from your questions, from your comments, and of course, from your critiques. So let's start where this actually begins. We're going to go way back. I'm going to take you back to my earliest form of street level practice. I started tagging in junior high school. We're talking late 80s in the city of Montebello here in LA's historically predominantly Latinx East Side. Graffiti is how I was exposed to cities and to urban culture. What you're looking at here, this is one page from one of my many sketchbooks from back in the day. I'm very appreciative that my mom saved all of my work because I'm able to share this with you, and it has a lot of importance for the formation of embedded planning. What you see here is me in my sketchbook recreating city space. These are the city spaces that I wanted to eventually graduate to as a tagger, right? You start off in your sketchbook, but you graduate to the street level. It's the sign, as you see on the left side, it says Spring Street. This is downtown LA. This is downtown LA after white flight and deindustrialization. This is a historic core that at the time, late 80s, early 90s, was basically abandoned. This became a canvas for all of us doing graffiti. The buildings are tagged up here with the writers, the graffiti writers that I looked up to. Graffiti is about challenging authority. It's about creating art on the ground, on the street level, without permission. And to be a graffiti writer worth your own moniker, you have to eventually graduate from these sketchbooks to the streets. Within a couple of years, I did graduate to those streets. My moniker was Scuzz. Here's a mural I did in 10th grade, 1993. I was about 16 years old. This is in the Silver Lake area of LA before it became LA's most gentrified area. So what we see here is, this is me on the ground, right? This is me producing art and culture at the street level. This is me creating art, not in a gallery, not in a studio, and no longer in my sketchbook, but I'm doing it on the ground, right? Feet on the ground, cultural production. when you're doing graffiti, you have to learn how to navigate urban space. You have to know, where you're going and how you're going to get there and how you're going to do it safely. Who do I need to look out for? Who do I need to run from? Which police jurisdictions am I crossing through? Is it LAPD or LA County Sheriff or one of the smaller police departments? Which gang territories am I crossing through? Who's gonna be mad that I'm disrespecting their wall space, right? And of course, you always have to look out for vigilantes. This is all part of my formative experience being on the ground, kind of producing and understanding urban culture at the street level. Now, at the same time of doing this, I'm a student at Montebello High School. And I was fortunate to be in an architecture program all 4 years where I learned how to build models and do construction documents. This is where I learned discipline. This is where I learned the beginnings of design and spatial thinking. On the left here is a photo of me in, I think this is 93 or 94, when I won first place in the Builders Industry Association model building contest. And I'm proud to tell everybody here that we always beat the better funded private school across the freeway. That meant a lot to us. So, this architecture program was a creative complement to the work that I was doing as a graffiti writer. And again, I was able to graduate, as you see on the right side of my screen here, because I had this architecture program that kept me from dropping out of high school. Now, I went on to study architecture at East LA Community College, and I learned even more advanced sort of spatial thinking and critical thinking, and I learned critique, right? My design work got more complex. Here, I'm channeling the work of Frank Gehry in my residential design. You can see the step I've taken ahead. I stayed in architecture for a couple more years until I had some political awakenings about that field and about the privilege that I saw in architecture and about the instances of racism and classism that I think I first encountered as an architecture student when I went on to study at a different school. So, I ended up realizing that this was not a field for me. I changed my majors and I started to study political science at Cal State LA, at a state university. I did that so I could investigate the race and class inequities that I encountered in architecture. And these were inequities that I knew were rendered in the built environment, in the forms and the policies of my neighborhood and others like mine. So the next step, I tell myself, well, I want to make this all make sense. I want to bring it all together. If architecture is a micro scale where I was focusing on buildings, I wanted to zoom out and look at the macro scale where I was looking at politics and the struggle around the buildings. All the politics and struggle happening in community spaces. So I asked myself, what is that? In the act of zooming out. And that's how I figured out about urban planning. That's what I learned what urban planning was, the politics of design, the politics of city building. So here's a portion of my master's capstone from UCLA Urban Planning, where I went to school. This is from 2005. This is a study of the Yucca Corridor in Hollywood. And it is an analysis of crime prevention strategies for LA neighborhood councils. It's a map, what you see here on the screen is a mapping analysis of all the crime prevention fortifications in the Yucca Corridor. Now, back in the 80s, this was probably one of the most dangerous streets, not only in Hollywood, but in Los Angeles. So it was eventually heavily fortified with surveillance cameras and gates and traffic control bollards and saturated police presence. My chair at UCLA Urban Planning, Edward Soja, had called this security-obsessed urbanism. And now we call it hostile architecture. And it actually is something that I continue to write about today. So, one thing I want to raise up here is you can see in me approaching the end of my urban planning studies with this capstone, I'm engaging design, I'm engaging politics, once again on the street level. This is design and politics and the analysis thereof on the street level, continuing that legacy of having my feet on the ground. So I graduated from urban planning school, 2005. I joined LA County Department of Regional Planning in 2006. And I get the opportunity to work as a planner on the ground, doing zoning enforcement. Now, regional planning is unique in that urban planners enforce the code in all of the unincorporated areas throughout LA County, which is a lot of land. This is unique because it's typically retired cops or building inspectors or some other municipal agent. It's typically not planners. So for nearly 13 years, I was on the ground in South Central LA. And you can see here that I'm very happy to be back in my element as a former graffiti writer, back in my roots in this abandoned industrial yard where there were some zoning violation issues and we had to talk with the neighbors. Now, I enforced all zoning codes, residential, commercial, industrial, agriculture, you name it. But the vast majority of work that I did was informal housing enforcement. Now, South Central LA is an area that you might know. It's the geography that encompasses Watts and Compton, and it is a geography that is predominantly Latinx and Black communities. This is not an area that needs additional policing or sort of pseudo policing from a quasi zoning enforcement cop. This is an area that instead needs resources. So I and my colleagues, we turned enforcement on its head in doing this work. And I serve less as a regulator and more as a resource on the ground, an educator, a partner to the community, a problem solver. On the left here is an example of that informal housing condition that was very common that you still see today that I often had to enforce. This is an unpermitted occupied RV in someone's backyard that is placed too close to the main house. You see the pink wall there, and it is built under an unpermitted patio cover. So you have a lot of zoning violations in this person's backyard. And I'm the person who had to go to people's homes and businesses and give them this bad news. Tell them that they had done something wrong. But at the same time, I would use those opportunities, me at their doorstep to help them understand what zoning is, understand what planning is, and help them find solutions to this. Not just give them a violation notice and bark at them and walk away, but say, hey, we can figure this out together. And I'm doing this all while demystifying what planning is, again, at their doorstep. So, I went beyond my job description. I and my colleagues in South Central, we went beyond our job descriptions. And I started building in street level activism in this work. My years as a street level planner got me thinking about this approach that I was doing. I was taking planning to the ground, to the street level, again, feet on the ground, right? I want to just highlight something that is an image that was very common for me. These very substandard and heartbreaking images of informal housing. This is something that I had to inspect and sort of manage on the ground every day. This is a converted and occupied and rented out garden shed in someone's backyard. And the gentleman inside who has been redacted, so I respect his confidentiality. I had to tell him that, I understood that he was paying rent, but this was still unfortunately unpermitted. It was a place that he had to move out to, right? So again, I'm bringing this bad news, I'm bringing the planning code to them. But at the same time, I'm telling him and others like him, but let's work together to help you find solutions. Let me connect you to the Housing Rights Center as one instance. So from this experience, being out there with this proximity to the neighborhood, I'm really thinking about what it means and the value of taking planning to the streets. And at the same time, I'm realizing that this street level work that I'm doing is actually the exception to the rule. Because outside of my work in zoning enforcement, what you see here on this screen, this was the vast majority of the spaces that planners were doing their work in. This is where the vast majority of work was done in my department and at other city planning and private sector firms and nonprofits that I visited. This was the space of labor for planners. It was at a desk. It was not in the neighborhood. And I finally, it hit me. Planning is a desk-bound profession. And from that realization, I could see why there were so many disconnects between the plans that were being created by planners who never went to the neighborhoods that they supposedly planned with and planned for. They never went to the neighborhoods and they simply did not know the people that were there. And I wasn't alone in my frustration. This is a 2003 blog post from James Bowe up in Canada. He captures it. He's writing about planners and arrogance here in this piece. And he says, but however much planners reach out to the public, planners still tend to do so from the point of view of, we have these great ideas that we think you would like. Let us tell you about them. Let us come to you occasionally and tell you all these great ideas we have about your neighborhood. How could you have great ideas about a community that you don't really know? A community that you don't go to? So I knew the street realities, of course, because I was out there, I was on the ground. I started to ask myself again, how do I take this nebulous idea of, planning on the street level and turn it into something? How do I make it an intentional sort of activist approach that I've been doing on my own? Well, I remembered something that I had learned back in UCLA urban planning. That is this method from Gregory Ulmer called the CAT method, and I want to share it with all of you. Gregory Ulmer is a professor of English at the University of Florida. He is one of the earliest scholars of writing on the internet, online writing. 1994, there's a book he writes called Heuretics, The Logic of Invention. And in that book, in the very beginning, in the first couple pages, Ulmer provides a method on writing manifestos. Of course, a manifesto being an attack on orthodoxy and your announcement of your new idea, your new approach to replace that and change the world. So I remember this from my time at UCLA Urban Planning, and I started to use this to flesh out my idea. Let me break it down for you. So the CAT method is deliberately a bit tongue-in-cheek. This will help you remember it. It's a mnemonic for memory. It has 5 steps, and here's what they are: contrast, analogy, theory, target, and tale, or tale, as in tale a story, and tale of a cat. So I'm going to go through this operation to show you how the CAT method works and how I used it to give shape to my idea of embedded planning. So contrast, this is what you start off with. Identify a problem in your field. What are you pushing against? Analogy. Liken your new approach to other approaches elsewhere. Who can you borrow ideas from? Theory. Seek legitimacy for your new approach from existing theories. What are the theories out there that help you develop your own? Target. Identify a space to implement your new approach. Who's your audience? And then finally, tale. Represent your new approach in its new form. What does your new approach look like in the world? So from using Ulmer's CAT method, I was able to flesh out what I was thinking about, what I was sort of wrestling with in my mind, this nebulous idea. This is what the CAT operation looked like when I started to give embedded planning shape. Contrast. What am I contrasting? Desk-bound, orthodox, rational planning. Analogy. Where am I drawing analogous ideas from? Social work, community and labor organizing, inspection, and embedded librarianship. There's actually a method of librarianship where librarians go to the people rather than coming to the library, right? Theory. Well, we have a lot of great theories in planning. I drew from advocacy and equity and radical and insurgent planning theories. Target. My target was the planning enterprise, all that we do as planners. And then tale, street level praxis, which I eventually dubbed embedded planning. This is the planner embedding herself in the community. Now from this, I was able to write down the road after thinking about it, doing that CAT operation, this 1-page manifesto called We Cannot Plan from Our Desks in the 2018 issue of Planning Magazine. And this is where I finally declared embedded planning exists and it's a better way to plan. And We Cannot Plan from Our Desk is not only the title of our presentation today, it is the maxim. This is sort of the rallying cry. This is what brings us all together. So we now have the backstory of embedded planning. Let's define this praxis. Let's give it a definition. Embedded planning situates the urban planner on the ground, in the community, to understand people's needs, to build trust and authentic relationships, to increase participation for marginalized communities through that street level engagement, to participate in daily community life. And all of this advances equity. It's a praxis in that embedded planning takes ideas, it takes theories, it takes concepts, and it puts them into action. And the point is to make positive and lasting change to better our world. So we're going to take a look at now what the praxis actually looks like on the ground. And I want to highlight that what you're going to see here is entirely doable in your own communities. This is why it's a praxis. It's an idea that can be replicated and taken elsewhere. But I first want to acknowledge the geography where this praxis was born. We always have to acknowledge the places and spaces that made us. Embedded planning was born on the streets of South Central LA. There's no way it would have ever been born elsewhere. This is a geography that has been subject to damaging planning practices, redlining, environmental racism, deliberate disinvestment, and just so much more. It's a geography that needed those tailored, empathetic, really proximate, close planning services, not extra policing, those proximate, close, empathetic planning services. Now, I worked throughout South Central in my time at the County of LA, but the vast majority of time I spent was in the community of Florence Firestone. That's the unincorporated area just north of Watts. Community members embraced me as an ally when I showed them that I was trustworthy, that I was authentic, that I was driven by equity, and I could be trusted, right? So embedded planning really traces back to Florence Firestone. Almost all of the images you're going to see here today are coming from Florence Firestone. So what does embedded planning look like? The first thing, the most important thing is you have to go to the people. You can't make the people come to you. You need to get out of your desk. You need to get into the street. You need to try to make the neighborhood your office. Relocate your planning work as much as possible to the street level. It doesn't mean that you have to do all of your work on the ground. You might still have meetings. You might still have commission hearings. You might still be in an office to some degree. You might be in a work from home environment. The point is to try to relocate your work as a planner as much as possible to the street level so you can build relationships in the spaces of community members. Go to them, don't make them come to you. We have to always remember that the spaces that we work in as planners are very intimidating spaces. I think of LA City Hall here, and I think of the barrage of metal detectors and the heavily militarized police that people have to walk through just to get inside, right? And it's very similar in other city halls around the country. And oftentimes these are where you have to go to talk to the planner. That's how you keep people at arm's length. When you go to the people, like me here, going to the Florence Firestone Merchants Association, you bring your planning knowledge to them. So this is me with Gloria Medina and her family and the Florence Firestone Merchants Association, one of many instances of me going to their pop-up events, taking planning knowledge to them. And I'll join their table. I'll be there tabling alongside them. I'll answer questions for them, and I'll answer questions and we'll have dialogue about urban planning for anybody else who's walking by. You're able to do this because you are on the ground in the community spaces. When you're doing that, you are advancing equity. Another form of embedded planning, doing community walks. Organize and take part of walking the block with your community members. This is how you see urban planning issues up close, right? You see it up close and personal. You're using all 5 of your senses. You should be able to look and see and touch and smell and taste and hear a neighborhood. That's how you understand a neighborhood. Google Street View does not suffice. When you're out there on the ground, when you're doing walking tours, when you're walking the block with the neighborhood, you see what's working, you see what's not working, you start to talk about what needs improvement, you share knowledge, and you also learn from the community. So here what's happening is, this is on Florence Avenue, a very bustling, vibrant street in Florence Firestone. And this property that we're standing in front of is a rare occasion. It's a vacant lot on Florence Avenue. And it's odd considering how bustling this street is. Well, I'm telling the story of this vacant lot. I'm letting the community members know the reason why this has been vacant is because it burned down in the 1992 LA uprising. It was a Newberry shoe store that burned down. And it was issued planning permits for a rebuild that were never used. And it ended up becoming a code violation problem that I had to manage a lot, right? So I knew the story of this lot because I had managed it on the ground. I had done the research and I had talked to the absentee property owner who lived very far away and had to be constantly cited by me to clean up this lot. I was able to tell them the story and to, sort of bring in some social history here. And as I described to the community, I consider this a scar on our landscape. It's a scar from the 92 uprising. Luckily, there's some conversations about turning this into a community garden. And we'll see where that goes. I'm part of those conversations now. But the reason why I know this and the reason why I can share this is because I'm doing these walks with the community members and telling them these stories and learning from them too. The next thing that embedded planning looks like is, taking all this time and knowledge and research that you do and turning it into resources like a community history book. When you're on the ground, you learn the people's stories. You learn their family stories, and you can partner with them to tell their stories. These are stories that might otherwise be untold and forgotten. I served as a co-author and a community navigator for the first ever book written about Florence Firestone. Never been written about in book form, right? We worked together with the community to co-author a book that was funded by LA County. And I'm very proud to tell you that I wrote the chapter on the public libraries in this area. What I learned as an embedded planner is that the public libraries in this area and throughout South Central, indeed, the public libraries are the most trusted spaces of local government, right? No one was ever afraid to go into the library. No one was ever afraid to talk to the librarians or their paraprofessional staff. But you couldn't say that about many other county departments. So I uplifted the county library history in this book. And our community members who were co-authors uplifted their own stories. Well, planners, we can learn from this. We can learn from these history books. We're going to be seeing in a couple slides the Florence Firestone Community Plan. That plan was able to be finished in part because of the research that we did and published in this very book here. Tell the community stories, work with them to write their histories. Next is something that is common to all jurisdictions. So you can do this no matter where you are. Every city, every county, every town, every village has a code enforcement function. It might be called neighborhood preservation. It might be called code compliance, whatever the nomenclature, everyone has this. Again, at the county, we were planners doing zoning enforcement. So I was out there on the ground implementing the code, actually implementing the code with empathy, with patience, with respect, always in plain language and always in the language of the people. So in Florence Firestone, if you didn't speak Spanish, it was time to learn because you need to be able to communicate with the people. Community-based code enforcement means walking the street, building relationships, building trust as you're going up and down the block, and understanding why people are possibly out of compliance, right? It's not that everyone was a scofflaw. Oftentimes people were coming from other spaces and places that don't have the same regulatory apparatus that is planning. So, when people were building informal housing, it's not that they wanted to say, screw you to the county code. It's that they needed housing and they weren't even aware that codes existed, right? When you're on the ground, you can bring them that knowledge. Instead of being a finger-wagging bureaucrat, you can be that resource. So on the left is an example, walking the block. I'm explaining the history of Florence Avenue to these two newly hired zoning enforcement planners. I'm explaining the importance of that car wash, that signature Googie architecture, roadside architecture that you see. Unfortunately, the car wash is going to be removed and replaced with housing. Housing is important. Although, as I learned from being on the ground, the community was upset that they weren't consulted. It was done ministerially, not through discretionary reviews because of new housing laws that allowed it. And this historic resource is being removed. So I was able to help these two newly hired planners understand that history because I was close and I was trusted and the people could share their stories. On the right here, you see the partnerships formed being a community-based code enforcement inspector. William and Steve here, William being a resident and Steve being a business owner. It's very rare for somebody enforcing the code to get a hug, right? Like most of the time they keep you at arm's length because you're bringing them bad news. But this is the kind of relationship that we had and we continue to have. Even though I no longer work there, we continue to talk to this day because I was close to them as a community-based code enforcement planner, serving as a resource and an educator, not necessarily as an intimidating regulator. We talked about community plans. All communities do this in some form. The Florence Firestone Community Plan was 10 years in the making. They had a lot of starts and stops, but I can tell you that we got it over the finish line through embedded planning. We had those relationships. We were working on the ground. I and my colleagues, using embedded planning techniques, were able to bring in additional voices that would have been forgotten, and they were part of the process. We crafted goals and policies and implementation actions that reflected their daily lives, right? When you're a part of the community, when you're part of that daily life, you turn that into plan actions, goals, and policies that reflect their daily lives. Incidentally, there's a chapter in here, an element called building partnerships. I wrote that. I wrote that at the request of staff, and it is written from an embedded planning perspective. So we'll drop in a link later. You can see that. But yeah, the plan itself is imbued with embedded planning. Couldn't have been done without it. When you're an embedded planner in a community, you get to know the people, right? Because you're in their spaces. You get to meet the community members. You get to know their dreams. Erica here on my right, somebody I met in 2014 through the community planning process. She told me back then that her dream was to go to UCLA urban planning. So when she found out that I went there, she said, how do we make this happen? Well, I told her, let's start working together. She got involved in the community leaders group. I became her mentor. Years later, I was one of many people who wrote her a recommendation letter. And I am honored to tell you that she is just about finishing up now her second year. She'll be graduating from UCLA urban planning. I know her through embedded planning praxis. Now we're going to take a little journey outside of South Central. We're going to go to East LA, where I was born and raised. East LA and South Central share struggles. All of the difficult planning issues, redlining, environmental racism, disinvestment are in existence in East LA. I have been a recurring guest speaker at a public high school, not a charter, public high school within the LA Unified School District called East LA Renaissance Academy. And you know, East LA is LA's predominantly, you know, sort of Latinx Mecca. The place where, again, where I was born and raised. So, you know, this is me, an example of me going back to my own neighborhood as an urban planner to inspire future planners. East LA Renaissance Academy is an urban planning high school. You learn how to do urban planning and design, only one of 3 in the nation. The teachers, though, are not urban planners, they're teachers. So they bring in a lot of guest speakers. I've been going here since 2017. As much as I can, I continue to do so in the pandemic through Zoom. This is about representation. This is so that, you know, in embedding myself in this classroom, these students see an urban planner who looks like them, talks like them, comes from the same streets, and knows their history. While I'm here, I'm demystifying what urban planning is for these students, and then they're taking that knowledge back home to their parents and their families. So, you know, embedded planning finds many different ways to situate itself in community spaces in order to advance equity. Now we're going to be wrapping up here in terms of what embedded planning looks like. I want to let everybody know it continues in the pandemic. Most recently, I had pivoted from the County of LA to the nonprofit called the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust. Fantastic organization. I recommend everybody look them up. It's an organization that does park equity work, developing parks and gardens and green spaces exclusively in LA's communities of color. So I worked with my colleagues doing park design and community engagement, and we used embedded planning methods. We embedded ourselves in the spaces that were under development or renovation for our parks. The only difference really is we added face coverings and hand sanitizer and some social distancing, but the work of street level praxis continues. So I'm here to tell you that embedded planning did not cease in the pandemic. It evolved and the equity-driven focus continues. All right, so now that you know what it looks like, we have an idea, you know, the shape that it takes. I want to talk to you about what I think are the benefits of this praxis based on my experience. So 5 benefits. We're going to start with this one. I've talked about this. We're going to double down. You know the community personally when you do embedded planning. You meet the leaders, you meet the shot callers, you start to meet all the different generations of leaders. You understand the people's wants and needs and desires and dreams. And whatever you're working for, whether it's city government, nonprofit, private sector, You are putting a face on your organization by going into the community and situating yourself as much as possible on the ground. You're putting a face to planning. You build trust, you cultivate authentic relationships as a planner. That is very important in what we do. The second benefit, you demystify what planning is. We explain what we do in plain language. We explain the importance of adding people's voices into the process, right? You're going to community spaces, explaining what it is, why I'm, look, I've heard it a lot of times. I say planner, people ask, oh, you're a wedding planner? And then they'll say, oh, no, you're a party planner. And it isn't until the third or fourth time that I'll say, I'm an urban planner. Let me explain what that is. I never fault the people. It is incumbent on us as planners. We must demystify what we do. When you're an embedded planner, that's what you're doing. And you're especially doing this for folks who need it. They find it helpful because they don't have that same planning regulatory apparatus in the spaces and places that they come from. Third benefit, you remove barriers to access. This is a way to deinstitutionalize planning, right? Take it out of those stuffy and intimidating offices, relocate it to the streets, remove the barrier of access. You take it out of the commission hearings and community meetings and auditoriums that can be a little tense, where a lot of the loudest voices sort of dominate. And instead, you bring the process to the people. And that helps people be a part of planning. Number fourth benefit is that you start to plan with actual street knowledge. Remember that feet on the ground experience. You know what's actually happening on the ground. You know the nuances, you know the actualities, you know sort of the contours and shades of the neighborhood and its needs. You learn what may not be raised in traditional engagement spaces because people may not want to bring it up around others. You start to create plans and policies and ordinances and all this that reflects actual lived experience. And the fifth benefit is that you empower your community members. You bring knowledge to the people, right? You're starting to remove those barriers. People are now planning. You're helping people plan with that unique knowledge that would have possibly been inaccessible. Instead of navigating bureaucracies, people are now aware of and working on planning and thinking about planning, and instead using their time to inform action, right? So you're helping to make those giant leaps forward. And I think it's really important for us to point out that embedded planning is good for engagement, but it really needs to go beyond that to empowerment. Ultimately, with that fifth benefit, you're helping people take charge of their own communities so that perhaps they won't need city and county planners anymore. They can kind of lead it on their own. You can do that because, again, you're doing all these things to relocate planning to the street level, remove barriers, and bring them into the process. Now, with that being said, I want to offer everybody here a balanced perspective. So there are challenges. I've certainly lived through many, and I'm going to highlight them for you. There's three that I want to highlight today. The first is getting buy-in from bosses. I've heard a few bosses say, well, this is just too political. This is a landmine. It's too political, and I don't want to do it. There's also the challenge of having resistance from coworkers, from staff, from fellow planners. I'm aware of one particular planner that I used to work with who went behind my back and was disparaging embedded planning and disparaging my work. And this particular person decided to say, well, that guy, he's just doing community organizing. He's not even a planner anymore. That whole embedded planning thing, that's just organizing. As if they're mutually exclusive, right? And three, this is something that is a struggle that I've lived with. When you're really close to people, when you have that intimacy, when you have that proximity to their lives, you see it all. And that includes, the stuff that people are going through, the traumas, the hardships. There are a lot of things that I wish I could unsee. And I wish I could unknow from traumas and hardships that I've experienced being that close to people. So it's important to know that when you're thinking of putting embedded planning into place, know that it comes with that. It comes with that reality. So to the challenges, here are my responses. Number one, for those bosses who don't necessarily want to give buy-in, the planner, we need to find allies. And you know what? Everything we do is political. Everything we do, even checking a side yard setback, is political, right? The fact that it's codified somewhere and it's 5 feet or 3 feet, that's a political determination. And it went through a political process. And you know what? It likely is imbued with middle class values, right? So all of these things are political. Everything that we do is political. Planners should start by seeking out allies, coworkers, community members of like mind who are interested in embedded planning. You want to build that bottom-up support so that it's not just you and you have that support from below. This is how we make change happen above. When we have that grassroots support, we can start to convince those bosses and those shot callers above that this is something worth looking at. Find allies. Number 2, regarding resistance from staff. Well, first let me say, there's no hierarchy between planning and organizing. I reject and I absolutely resented that comment that planner made behind my back, not to me personally. They're not mutually exclusive. Planning and organizing work together. Planning is not above. This is all part of praxis making change happen on the ground. So I don't accept that. But regarding that resistance, talk to your colleagues. We as planners should start dialogue. We should explain the idea that we have, this embedded planning idea, in plain language. Explain that it has worked. And it explained that it can be replicated. We saw it in my slides today. I think that is entirely doable. It's possible. Now, at the same time, we should also know that we can never convince everybody, and it's okay if we don't get everybody on board. The third thing about stress and being close, we need to practice self-care. Seek work-life balance to prevent burnout. People's lives are at the heart of planning, and what we do affects their lives. And oftentimes we have to tell people bad news, and oftentimes we have to be involved in results that are traumatic. It hit me one time. I wondered how many houses, whether they were informal or otherwise, how many housing units did I remove as a zoning enforcement planner? Even if they were informal, it hit me that the actions that I was taking as a planner likely resulted in people being unhoused. And when that hit me, it really hurt. I guess I never really thought about it. And I learned not to bottle up my emotions. You know what I started doing in terms of self-care? I started doing this. I started writing about informal housing. I started telling people stories. I started doing these presentations. Communicate, share, open up, speak with your colleagues, your friends, and your family. We're trying to change the world here as planners, but know that we can't do it all, and we have to take some time to rest. So take a step away and watch Netflix, right? Like, there is time for that. It's okay. And then get back at it to change the world. Turn it off at some point and try to enjoy some personal time to have that self-care. So we are getting close to a close, and I'm going to be offering everybody 5 takeaways for planning theory and practice. But first, I'm going to tell you the story of my background image here, the story of this wall. So before COVID, when we had the National Planning Conference in person, there was usually a wall in the big lobby of the auditorium, and the APA would say, they would give kind of a directive. They would write on the wall a directive to planners, and there were markers there. So this is April, I think this is April or May 2018. This is the San Francisco National Planning Conference. This was the last one before, I believe, before we went into the pandemic mode. The question on the wall was, how do we advance equity? How can we move to equity? Several of my mentees from California State University Northridge here in LA, they got there early, they were in a large group, and they saw this wall, they saw this directive that said, how can we advance equity? Well, you know, being good, inspired graffiti writers that they are, knowing my story, so I suppose, they got the tallest student to hit the top of the wall, as we would do when we were doing graffiti. You want to get that prominent space. They hit the top of the wall, and they responded to the APA's question by writing, "We cannot plan from our desks." And they were very gracious to put my initials next to it. Now, the students did this entirely on their own. I didn't know they were going to do it. I didn't even know that they were there. they took it upon themselves to declare that the solution to advancing equity, one of them at least, is through embedded planning. They sent me this picture, and I knew we had something. I knew we had a movement afoot. I knew that this was not just a parochial idea for me, but an idea for all of us, that it had excitement and that it was moving in a positive direction. And I think we've seen that in the fact that we are here today together. So these are the takeaways as we wrap up. Takeaways for theory and practice. Number one, start with your own origin story. Many of us got into planning because of a political awakening, right? Mine, was through my difficult experiences in architecture. A lot of people these days are experiencing housing precarity and so many other political awakenings. You're not alone in this. Your origin story, I guarantee you, is shared with others, and you can really, drive your equity-driven work forward, knowing that, you're rooting your praxis in your own story and stories like yours, because your stories are going to be similar to others and they will inspire others. When you're also, rooted in your own origin story, it helps you stay grounded. Your origin story helps you stay focused and, be equity-driven in the face of politics. Your origin story is the origin story of other people too. Number two, find a way to bridge that pesky theory practice gap, very common in urban planning. Theory is a lens through which we see the world. We learn theories in academia. We learn theories in planning school for sure. And too often we leave them in planning school. I can't tell you how many colleagues I learned said, I just learned about equity and rational and advocacy planning just for the test. And they forgot about it once we got into practice, right? Well, I can see what happens. Planning often lacks that conceptual foundation that's meant to inform our work. So embedded planning, I think, is a way to bridge that. As a praxis, I think it's a way to bridge that gap. It puts theoretical concepts into action to make change. Third takeaway for us today is to be unorthodox as planners. Be bold, be different, be audacious, be real. Think about that CAT method. Use that CAT method to do something unorthodox. Create your own praxis and find ways to challenge planning orthodoxy. The fourth takeaway is to manifest your ideas. I'm talking speaking them into existence, declaring that you will be a planner who seeks equity, and then you follow up, you do it. Write your manifesto, find ways to live it. This is how you bring your praxis to life. And then finally, as far as my takeaway, join us. This is a horizontal movement. Anyone who believes in this maxim, we cannot plan from our desks, is an embedded planner. This is not mine, this is ours. We need more emerging planners to advance this movement. I want you to start thinking about how embedded planning would look in your neighborhood. I want you to start thinking about how the praxis would be done. If you were doing it, use that CAT method. I'm telling you, this is how we can advance street level equity in our communities. And I will be closing today with a dedication. We're here today because a University of Utah student came across embedded planning and recognized that this equity-driven approach would help her community and communities like hers. And that student is Bianca Paulino. She's here. She read my intro. Last year, Bianca interviewed me for that very foundational interview a planner assignment. Not only did she turn that conversation, which I learned a lot from too, into a polished presentation, which you see a couple images here today, but she also advocated for embedded planning as a future public talk. And we're here today because of it. We're here today because of Bianca. So Bianca, I want to thank you for your advocacy. You got us here. I dedicate this talk to you. Keep pushing, keep advocating, keep speaking up, and thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. We're going to do Q&A and we'll go beyond the time, but before we start, while everyone's here, I just wanted to say a few words. First, this was super inspiring and motivating and, kind of lights a fire under everyone, I hope. Thanks. And I don't want to take up too much time because I'm sure there are questions. the other thing I just want to say is thank you to Claudia for just being the coordinator for the series this semester and finishing it off with this really exciting lecture. So thank you, Claudia and Jonathan. And then the last thing I want to say, it's just been really fun getting to know you, Jonathan, and I hope that you can continue to connect with us. Even though you're in California, with Zoom, we can stay connected. So
let's do it. Zoom erases geography in some sense.
Yeah. So just a couple of quick things, and then we'll go to Q&A. And I know some of you will have to leave on the hour, and we'll follow up with a video recording and a survey, just asking you about your feedback of today's session, and also asking you a little bit about just things you'd like to see for our next series, probably starting in the fall. So if there's topics you want us to do or workshops, and just let us know. So thanks again, and I'll just hand it back over to Jonathan and Q&A. So I guess if you want to raise your hand or post something in the chat, we'd love to just hear your thoughts.
Looks like we have Minerva who raised her hand. You want to unmute yourself, Minerva?
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan, for taking the time to speak with us. It's a pleasure to be able to get your perspective, especially all the experience that you have. One thing that came to mind was as you were talking about how we could talk to our colleagues and do this in practice, how did you juggle the priorities that your department had and simultaneously do embedded planning if it wasn't seen as a priority in your department?
Thank you, Minerva. I love talking about this because this is something that is replicable if you choose to. So when you are in the public sector, your job duties are very well defined, right? They're actually codified somewhere in the county code. So you know exactly what you're supposed to do in terms of your direct outline of responsibilities. So I always took care of those. I always took care of the direct ask of me so that no matter what, that they could never say that I wasn't doing my job. Here's the thing that I did that I think if you are interested, one could do this. I started to go above and beyond those job duties, but sort of staying within the parameters, right? And that was the only way that I would be able to accomplish what I wanted to do, right? Flush out street level praxis. I started to go above and beyond. And I chose to do this not only during work hours, right? Like when I was out on the street level, if I was expected to issue a violation notice, so be it, I'll do the inspection, I'll do that. But then there's no bosses around me, so I can take an extra 30 minutes or an hour, whatever the community member needed, to do that above and beyond work while still within the parameters of my role as a zoning enforcement planner. And I also started to do work on the weekends as sort of pro bono activist praxis. Now, I respect anybody's boundaries, of course. I wouldn't want anybody to think they have to do free labor. I'm also a labor organizer. So I chose to do this more like in the context of what I do in my labor organizing with, DSA LA, Democratic Socialists of America, or the labor union that I was a part of at the county. A lot of it was done as sort of service work above and beyond. And I kind of just folded embedded planning into that too. So I never felt like I was sort of self-exploiting or doing something that I wasn't comfortable with. I knew that if I wanted to go above and beyond to help folks in South Central, I kind of had to bend the rules a little, and like that old adage of it's better to ask for forgiveness than for permission. Had I asked for permission, it would have been an automatic no. It would have been an automatic no because it's not within the job title. It's not within that job description. So that's how I did it. I really sort of juggled it by doing a little bit on duty, off duty, and getting back to organizing. That's kind of the inside outside strategy, right? You do a little bit on the inside as an official planner, but then you do a little bit on the outside as a organizer.
Thank you for sharing.
And Jonathan, I think we have BT next. I just see your
Okay.
initials.
Hey, how's it going? This is Ben Tony. I'm actually also in Los Angeles right now.
Hey, Ben.
Hey, glad we were able to connect. This is all really cool stuff. I'm for other folks in the group, I'm doing a PhD at USC in the urban planning program right now. And I'm really I want to start with 2 points. Firstly, I'm really grateful that you are sharing your praxis and that you acknowledge the risk that you internalized, right? By deviating from what was sort of legally expected and required, right? And I think that that's one of the things that's really challenging with efforts to change the processes and outcomes of planning institutions and agencies, is that you can be punished for trying to change things, right? And,
Oh, I was eventually. We could talk about that.
right, but to be real with people, that that achieving institutional change, social change, material change can come at cost. And that's hard hard to contend
Absolutely.
with. And so I really appreciate you being transparent with that. I would love to ask, as a second part, to get a little bit deeper into details on the advantages and disadvantages with embedded planning, for those situations where there are people who have behaviors or practices that are considered violations of institutional sort of rule, right? And you can think about a lot of different subgroups of populations. You showed examples of, folks who have taken their own material capacity to meet their housing needs, by sort of adjusting form at the parcel level. Sometimes people do that within a parcelized system. Sometimes people do it on the sidewalk, right? You also have, other sort of mapped populations of deserving and non-deserving status, right? Where, through a general plan amendment process, if your project pencils economically, you're actually granted the institutional authority to violate code by design, right? And so I think for me, what's the point of this question? I think that I'm really curious. I think that I'm curious about what it takes to embed in different contexts where the community's understandings, the community's knowledges, the community's practices make it more challenging to build relationships, particularly for people who come from institutional arrangements, who come from formal professional sort of academy settings, who may not have as intimate a knowledge of lived experiences. And sorry, folks, I'm taking up way too much space. But yeah, can you talk to me a little bit about the challenges to embed when there are institutional sort of strictness parameters?
Thank you, Ben. And just so everybody knows, Ben is also a researcher who focuses on inside-outside strategy. So that was a pretty nice segue. And I think this kind of ties into that. The challenges, there are other challenges. I left us at 3, but there are also many benefits, and I left us at 5. There are neighborhoods where it would be very difficult to do embedded planning. When I started at the county, I didn't start in South Central. I started in a more eastern kind of conservative LA County suburb that would not have been down with it and would have not have supported it. And that's why eventually I had to make that pivot and move to an area where I could be the planner that I wanted to be. So I do want to point out that I think that there's always ways to do embedded planning. It just doesn't mean that it's not going to be embraced to the same degree that I was and my colleagues were in Florence Firestone in South Central, right? That being said, in acknowledging challenges, there's always ways to do it. Inside outside strategy, you can try to do some on duty and maybe some off duty if you were interested. In terms of embedding, it takes agency from a planner to want to do it, right? You have to want to go beyond that very narrow job description and say, I could stamp site plans, sure, but I could also do more, right? And you have to have that desire and agency and will to go beyond and to make overtures into areas that, like you said, Ben, may not be as supportive. You have to be a bit okay with risk rather than being risk averse. Something that I'm entirely comfortable talking about now because I'm far removed is when new management came in at the county in more recent times, they were very hostile to me. And that's one of the reasons why I left. They were very hostile to embedded planning. And I can say it now, finally, thank goodness. I can say it on record. But I was not risk averse. I was risk okay. And that's because I knew that no matter how much of a challenge it would be, how much of a hit it would be on my patients, it was all in service of people who needed help. So I accepted it, and I honestly accepted it until I kind of had to make some moves for health reasons. So I know we could go on a little bit longer, Ben, but I do want to highlight those two things. You got to have agency, and you have to be okay with the risk, and it's especially important for areas where you may not have that acceptance, like I did.
Perfect. And I think Ian had his hand up next.
Thanks. I like to talk, Jonathan. I think this is good work that you're doing. Sort of in light of seeing planning as a very political process, I'm kind of curious, and this sort of maybe is more theoretical than other questions might be, but I'm curious what you see the relationship between this sort of community-based embedded planning that you're advocating and the general commodification of housing and space generally, especially that you sort of get coming out of like real estate minded planners, but also just practice in general. So.
Thank you, Ian. I think embedded planning is a great way to equalize a lot of the power that developers have and that the moneyed interests have that lead to, a lot of, think about market rate housing production, lack of affordable housing that is done without engagement, or it is done with engagement that is transactional and extractive at best, or it is done very minimally. I certainly saw that in my time at LA County. When you're an embedded planner, when you're doing embedded planning praxis, I think it's a way to start evening that power imbalance because you're taking knowledge to the community to share with them, hey, you probably should be aware of these things that are coming down the pipeline. So I'll give you an example. One of the things that I was able to do is that I would go out to the community doing my work, and I would use my time and space and proximity to say, hey, there's some housing developments coming down the pipeline over here, and it's a ministerial review. It's not a discretionary review, which means, translating that planner jargon, there's no public hearing, which means that you're not going to be able to make a public comment. So if you want to make any kind of comment, you need to get in touch directly with the planner. And by the way, here's their number, here's their email, and here's the director's email too, right? Those kind of proximate relationships that you have as a planner with that trust, you're able to start balancing out those power imbalances, to give people to transmit that knowledge, and then to encourage them to run with it and start to do empowerment. What ended up happening when I did that a couple of times, people start organizing. Then they start getting together, and it's not a comment coming from one person, it's a comment from the whole block or a whole community group, right? And I was able to do that with embedded planning. It's so much harder to try to reach out to people when you don't know them and when they don't trust you. But I was able to have that kind of trust and relationship, and they knew that I was on the level. So they knew that information that I was bringing them was important. So with your scenario, I really see that as a way to tip the scales back into the community, so that the very moneyed interest that may only be driving for commodified, market rate housing don't hold all the power. By the way, I just see one of my colleagues from UCLA is here, Shauna, and she dropped a little note in the DM. Professor Edward Soja, who was my mentor, who I dedicated this talk to when I did it at UCLA in February. She indicates that he would be very proud of me. That means a lot, Shauna, thank you. I learned about activist praxis from Professor Edward Soja, a Marxist geographer who is no longer with us, and also from Jackie Levitt at UCLA, who is also sadly no longer with us. So I dedicated my talk to them and another colleague, VC Powell, when I did it in February. And I appreciate you, Shauna, for putting that out there. I hope that Ed is looking down and you know, giving me the nodding approval to keep pushing forward.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. We have a few more questions from Nick and Christine. I think Nick was next, and we have a few comments in the chat that we can also address in a little bit too.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm Nick Norris. I'm the planning director for Salt Lake City. And my question is going to be really, really quick is, can you provide your contact information? We do a summer planning series in a city that we had to put on hold last year that I'd love to talk to you about, perhaps as a guest speaker, because I think it would be really motivational, not just for my crew and my team, but also for some of our community leaders and community members who are interested in it.
Thank you, Nick. And also shout out to your work as planning director. I know that's a tough job. I am dropping my contact in the chat box now, and also my colleague Claudia has it. I've since left the LA Neighborhood Land Trust to do freelance consulting work. So I can tell you that this is entirely what I'm doing now. And I would be very, very honored to come and speak, whether it's virtual or in person. Let's do it.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
All right, and then Christine had one other question as well.
So Jonathan, thank you so much. This has been really helpful as ideas for how to promote equity and empathy. I serve on the City Planning Commission, and we live in an area with a lot of growth. So lots of proposals coming forward for new development, and some of them, you know, of course, don't fit the city's plans for that area. And maybe that's the arrogant planning that you're talking about. Like, we've got this great idea for what this should be, and the developers have other ideas. And I know that their livelihood is on the line with this project that they're proposing. So my question is, what advice do you have for planners and commissioners in finding some sort of balance between observing the code and also empathy and compassion and, you know, willingness to budge to allow them to, you know, complete the project?
Thank you, Christine. And of course, I know Planning Commission is difficult, so shout out to you for all that work. It's very challenging, very political. And that's exactly the position that commissioners often find themselves in, right? They're looking at discretionary projects, or they're looking at large scale amendments or new projects, new codes, new plans that pit different interests against each other. You know, I come from a perspective that always puts the community first. And if that is too one-sided, then so be it. I know that not all developers are bad, and I know that there are actually some good developers. I've met a few, and they're always a breath of fresh air, right? But in the end, as an embedded planner, I don't work for developers. I don't work in partnership necessarily with developers. If they really consider themselves part of the community, that's great. And then we're in conversation. The issue is that so many of them, from my experience, are very profit driven, right? Like you said, livelihood is on the line. They're very profit driven, and they got projects all over. So, you know, knowing that by and large, developers are about that bottom line, and they have their hands in this community and that community. And also knowing that many of them just don't want to do the engagement that's needed, and instead we'll settle with one-off or extractive engagement. I'm going to be honest. I side with the community. If there are developers who have demonstrated themselves that they are trusted, and if there are if it's community development, if it's really grassroots and bottom up, then I can see that balance a little bit more. But in the end, the community lives there. The community, they've been there. They're the ones who guide and direct it. It's their culture. It's their long-term life. It's not profit. There's no profit margins or profit driven motives. So I think with all that being said, if the community is not better off, and if it's not rooted in equity, and especially in areas where developers are wanting to make changes that don't fit with community plans and what the community has indicated what it wants and needs through the planning process, then we have to have the fortitude to say no. Or we have to have the fortitude to say, go back to the drawing board and redo it and come back, because this is not in the best interest of the community. I've been very comfortable in my time, 14, 15 years, being essentially a community advocate and not in any way an advocate for developers. I know it's so much easier for me to say because I'm not on the planning commission, but in the end, that's who I work for, and that's the embedded planning ethos, I think, is for the community.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I have never heard that one, and new questions always allow me to evolve and develop embedded planning. So thank you.
Wonderful. Jonathan, I think we had one more question pop up from Alessandro, and I think you saw Minerva's hand go up, but then.
Hey, Professor.
Yeah.
Hey, Jonathan, it's good to see you.
Good to see you. We got a chance to hang out a little bit in LA, so shout out to you in Utah now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm so glad to see people from our city, from different, the planning department, planning commission. It's really great, as well as folks from LA. I wonder if you can talk about how your practice overlaps with what a community organizer does from, say, a grassroots organization.
Thank you very much. That also ties into my work at the LA Neighborhood Land Trust, where you were very much part of and can continue to be part of our work there, a go-to resource. So thank you for that. We couldn't have done a lot of work without you. It does overlap. Embedded planning overlaps with organizing and with being an organizer in a few different ways. So the embedded planner is working on the ground in the space of the community in the same way that a community organizer or a labor organizer, for that matter, would be on the ground or on the shop floor, right? So you're taking your work and you're deinstitutionalizing it, removing it from the often intimidating spaces of planning and taking it to the spaces of the community. And again, this can still be done in our COVID times just with PPE. So that's one way. Another way is to, motivate people to take action. It's not just about the act of my favorite example, stamping a site plan, checking for the 5-foot side yard setback. It's about motivating. It's about bringing new knowledge and saying, let's do something about it, right? Taking action as a planner instead of just being sort of a caretaker for the code and doing that whole yes or no, yes or no. We can do so much more where we're embedded and working with people and inspiring people. Organizing, it's also about, breaking down barriers and hierarchies that often exist in planning and, showing people what solidarity looks like. And that's not often easy for planning. I think a lot of planners learn about solidarity and like I mentioned earlier, sometimes they learn it just for the test and then they forget all about it when they come out into practice. But there's a lot of solidarity that we can demonstrate when we're on the ground working in partnership with people. I see that we might be a little closer to time. So, I mean, I could keep going on. Thank you, Professor. I'll think about that a little bit more. And it looks like Oscar has his hand up too. So I want to make sure we have some time.
Yeah, hi, Jonathan. My name's Oscar. I'm a planning commissioner for the city of Huntington Beach. And I was referred to you by a good friend of mine, Jorge Padilla, who I think you studied with him at Santa Cruz, I believe. My question is, right now with the RENA numbers coming out for Orange County and LA County, and they're pretty high for like a city like Huntington Beach. And my concern as a community advocate here for lower income folks is, what do you think about low income housing tax credits coming into opportunity zones? Usually this is where a lot of the gentrification happens and displacement. So what could we do as planning commissioners? I know planning commission is a quasi judicial board. So, we have to adhere to some of the laws that the state of California kind of imposes on us. So what do you recommend we do, or how do you recommend we balance that out?
Thank you, Oscar. And, RENA being Regional Housing Needs Assessment numbers. And for folks that are not in the LA area, Huntington Beach, as Oscar can probably attest, is a fairly wealthy beach community, but it also has some diversity and diverse income. I know that things are difficult. Things are even more difficult in Orange County where you are, right? There's a sort of different ethos there with planning and with developing things like affordable housing. So I'm going to be honest, full transparency, I'm not very well versed in low income housing tax credits. I don't want to appear like I'm an expert when I'm not. So, just putting that out there. What I do want to say is, getting back to planning commission and getting back to embedded planning and your role as a planning commissioner. These are things that can be, they're complex, as you said. Sometimes they invite gentrification and displacement, but these are things that can be very just sort of dense and uninviting and mysterious to folks in Huntington Beach, and other places, right? A lot of planning knowledge is specialized knowledge, and it's really hard for people to crack it, especially when they don't have time, because right now our community members are working multiple jobs, and or planning commissions and commission hearings for that matter are scheduled in times of the day that people can't attend. So saying all that, with all that being said, I want to uplift the importance of, as a planning commissioner, being mindful of the Brown Act, the California Brown Act that governs how commissions are done. If you can, and if you could maybe work with colleagues and not violate any Brown Act issues, but if you can take that to the street somehow, if you could relocate the commission hearings to the street level, if you can demystify this very complex process that needs community input, but is often hard to get because, again, people just are unaware what planning is. If you can do that, that would go a long way in Huntington Beach to bring more people into your planning process that would want to know about RENA, that would want to know about opposition to. I know there's a lot. Some cities have a lot of opposition to what they consider imposed housing by the state, and tax credits. And I think these are processes that your community members would benefit from if they knew about it and they had the time and space. So just bringing it back to embedded planning and being mindful of the Brown Act, I would wonder if you can take meetings in some way out to the street level. And you as a commissioner, I think you're able to walk the block and do things as an individual without having an accidental quorum of all your colleagues coming together. So you too, right? You probably do this in some way. Get to know what people are thinking. Go out there with PPE, explain these concepts, and start getting people's ideas as not only a commissioner but as a community member. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, one more thing. In Orange County, a lot of cities are going through their housing element, and so one thing that I'm trying to do here in the city of Huntington Beach is actually use some of our resources to outreach to our lower income folks, where a lot of these low-income housing tax credits are coming in. And big money, especially with COVID, a lot of cities are getting a lot of this, money to build housing for the unhoused population. So Huntington Beach actually got some money, and we actually built a shelter with some of that money.
Good to know.
Yeah, we built a shelter, which was good. It was being, our city attorney for the longest has been not the best individual. You probably heard of Huntington Beach.
Yeah.
As someone that, as a city that has fought the state of California in many different areas, and especially housing and immigration. So, thank you so much for providing this information.
Thank you, Oscar. And knowing that there was an unhoused shelter built in Huntington Beach gives me a lot of hope. I also want to say, I just got something really quickly in the chat box from Paulo asking if, although it seems counterintuitive, does technology aid embedded planning? Technology helps embedded planning, right? It's another way to go to a particular online spaces. So it helps. Thank you, Paulo. But we really do need to try to be on the ground as much as possible, safely now, and embedded within the daily life of the community. But yes, it does help, and it can sort of boost and support that street level praxis.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. I know we went a little over time, but I can say that it was very worth it to hear everyone's questions and Jonathan's remarks. So thank you for staying on later, and for Jonathan making yourself available for answering questions.
Yeah.
But with that, again, just a huge appreciation, a shout out to Jonathan for all the supporters that came out to ask questions and to engage with us, and to Dr. Harwood and all the MCMP staff and faculty that supported the series in general. Again, if you want to take the post survey that was posted in the chat, just to let us know what you thought of the series in general and this particular keynote, that way we can plan for future opportunities as well. And then we'll also send out in an email the recording of the session and information for Jonathan if you want to follow up with him into the future. But again, just a huge thank you, and I think we're all the better for having heard the origin story of embedded planning. I think that's something that's going to stick with me forever. And another thought that came to mind as we were closing is that this is a universal topic, and there are a few chat remarks that were asking for more information on how to apply this in their own spaces. So we're excited to see what comes from you, Jonathan, into the future. And just again, thank you everyone for coming out, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.